the topic that I want to really share with all of you is I didn't start out my career in UX, and I really wanted to, in my own career path, I didn't want to, when I wanted to pivot into UX, I didn't want to start from square one. I really wanted to build on my existing experiences. So this is kind of my journey of how I found ways to build my portfolio and start and get into UX not as an entry-level role. So without further ado, I'll just share my nonlinear career path. I studied business in undergrad, and my first two jobs were more on the business side. First as a management consultant working with different industries, but I always had a passion for education. That's something that I've always wanted to work in. So when the opportunity came up to join a education company, I jumped on that boat and I did product strategy there, which actually mostly meant the same thing as consulting, is a lot of interviews and surveys to really understand the market. But while I was there, I really felt a disconnect between what I was doing and what I want to do. I realized that even though I was informing quote unquote high impact work, the strategy, but I realized I never talked to any of our users, any of our customers. I just felt the sense that maybe I don't know what's best, just based on these numbers. And just right around that time, I think when I was feeling this need to really get deeper into my interest in education, I also wanted a role change, but I didn't know what role I wanted to change into. At this moment, I had no idea UX existed. Cengage is a publisher, so it's a little bit more on the slower side of digital transformation, but today they have more of a digital product portfolio. When I was in graduate school, so I went to Graduate School of Education at Stanford, where I focused on learning science and also design. It was really awesome opportunity because I got a lot of chances to learn about design research through need finding courses, where my first assignment, I still remember, the professor Michael Berry from the D School told all of us to go sit in a cafe for 3 hours. Just go sit there and observe. At first, I was so confused. Like, what are we observing? 3 hours is a lot of time. Like, why are we going to the cafe? And so I literally remember sitting in there with a very skeptical mindset in the beginning. But then as the time passed on, as I started picking up on these like interesting behaviors and cues, I started forming my own like part of me is like, I also remember is like, don't tell too much stories in your own head. Just look at what are things that is observable. And I remember at the end of the 3 hours, I wanted to sit there longer. I just felt like I had so many questions about these people, what they were doing and why they were showing up the way they did, and what conversations they were having. And so that kind of is like an initial spark for me that this work is so deeply interesting to really understand human psychology, human behavior. I think that kind of really guided me a little bit in navigating my path through course selection in graduate school. And then afterwards, I still wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I had this inkling that I want to continue doing this type of design research type of work. So then I continued on for 8 months and picked up on different gigs. And eventually, 3 years ago, I landed my first full-time UX research role at Coursera. And today, the focus of the talk is really about this stage 4, the gigs, because I think like in retrospect, things are connecting better than when it did when I was in the middle of it. But now I can see some of the threads, and I really want to share my experience to hopefully maybe inspire others who are starting out in your career in UX. Perhaps you have an interest in research, which I see as this like specialization in UX field, where your job focuses a lot on deeply understanding user needs using research, qualitative interviewing, and survey methodologies. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, by this point, as you can see, I have about 3 years of professional experience. When I was thinking about doing more UX research work, I found opportunity to join big tech companies as a research assistant as the first stepping stone into the UX field. But I very seriously considered that path. but it just, to me personally, it felt like too much of a step backwards in my career. So I wanted to find an alternative way to break into UX. So I looked at how do people interview candidates. One of the first thing people always ask for is share projects with us. Where's your portfolio? As a researcher, actually, you don't necessarily have a portfolio website, but you do need to have projects under your belt to showcase. So that's where I decided I'm going to go out and find my own gigs to build my own portfolio. So at a high level, I did 4 gigs over the course of about 8 months. They're all in the roughly around education industry or semi-adjacent, because that, for me, I had already picked my industry of choice, and that's education. So my first gig, I worked at an elementary school. It's called the primary school in East Palo Alto, and it was about piloting a new edtech product at the school with 5-year-olds. It was really fun. It was a part-time gig, and then that actually led to an opportunity to join a really early stage edtech nonprofit called Talking Points. It was 5 people in total. I was actually brought on as the first product manager, but during my course of doing my 2 months of working there, I didn't have any mentorship. And so actually a lot of what Hugh mentioned about both the benefits of working at a startup, where I got to wear many hats and had a lot of freedom in how I approach problems. At the same time, I wanted to learn how to do product management, for example. In this case, I didn't have the mentorship, the resources to really build that muscle. But so what naturally I ended up doing is I leveraged the research toolkit and skill sets I had gained from graduate school and did a lot of foundational research and user testing for this company. So actually, it was very telling for myself, a signal that I'm maybe going down the right path when the founder of the company told me at the end of my two-month gig that, hey, you see, you actually didn't do anything you're supposed to do as a product manager. I was like, oh, this is going to be an interesting performance review. So what do you mean? And she said, well, you didn't build the product roadmap, but what you did is incredible research findings to actually help us understand better who we're serving, for the parents that we're serving. Would you like to continue doing research for us? I thought that was like just incredible market signal back to me. It's like, oh, the skill set I have and what I found naturally interesting for myself to do, and I'm naturally kind of more skilled at doing, is this thing called UX research. It was at this moment that when I realized, oh, I think I want to become a UX researcher. But at this moment, again, I don't have enough of a portfolio to go for a full-time UX researcher role yet. So I continued working at another gig with a philanthropic foundation. It was also just so fun, working with these different types of environments and getting to know how to manage different stakeholders from depending on the cadence of how they work. With the foundation, it was very different. It was more focus group based kind of research because we don't have the resources to conduct one-on-one interviews. Then from there, it led to I would say probably the first real UX research project was at the design agency Punchcut. I would say it's like similar size or slightly bigger than the design agency that you worked at, Hugh. It was a wonderful environment where I got to first time collaborate with a product manager and a UX designer very closely through the client that I worked with. So all of these gigs didn't happen at the same time. It was like one built on top of the other. Perhaps the next section I want to talk about is the 4 steps of actually landing gigs, like the ones that I found for myself. For me, the first one, the first step really is actually a mindset shift. Because prior to doing this 8-month exploration, I didn't know that it would be this long, to be honest. And it was really putting myself out there and being open to part-time job. Sometimes some of the gigs, they were 5 to 10 hours per week. Some of them were full-time, 40 hours per week, but it's variable. So just having an open and flexible mindset with what kind of gigs, what kind of structure a gig might be. It may not always be full-time. And the second one is actually around a lot of people, from my experience, not all organizations recognize the value of UX or UX research. So sometimes it's actually, it takes some selling, really pitching first, like our skill sets as UX people, professionals, and also helping to educate them a little bit on what kind of problems UX can really help solve. So, so the step two, from my experience, is actually identifying those people at the organization who are interested in innovation and change, and they're willing to hear about different approaches and actually are experiencing perhaps some bottlenecks because they currently don't have resources to solve the problems they're interested in solving. Step three is once you have identified these people and you actually get them on a call in some way or email, get a chance to really listen and to their answers to this question. What challenges are you facing? Sometimes, like, the challenges they describe are things that's outside of UX domain, but oftentimes a lot of the challenges they describe, from my experience, are actually, you can turn them into research questions, because a lot of times it's about ambiguity, it's about uncertainty. Is the company, is our strategy, is the next product launch like going to be successful? Well, dig in a little bit, like what are some concerns you might have? Or maybe we don't know enough about this particular market, or we don't know enough about how our parents, for example, are using a particular app. Just listen for those research needs. And then the last step here is then like formulating those challenges that you hear and turn them into research questions and pitch them back to the client, the organization, as something that you can help solve with research skill sets. I'm going to walk through these 4 steps with an example. The example I want to walk through is the primary school gig that I did, because I think this is a good example to share because this was my first gig. I always think like the first stepping stone is sometimes the hardest. Once you take that first step, I built a lot of confidence from having done this process and then iterating on that and continue. So identify people. So at this point, I already did step 1, right? I already opened up my mindset. It's like, okay, I'm gonna do some gigs. I'm gonna do some part-time work. That's okay. Step 2 is identifying people who are interested in innovation. So I identified there's this incredible woman named Yuxi Liu, who was the co-founder and chief design officer at this innovative elementary school. I was like, wow, a chief design officer, that title sounds very aligned. And I went to one of her talks, and through that I was connected with her. And when I found out that she was looking for some help, I reached out and had a conversation with her. And I did ask her, so what challenges are you facing? And one of the things that she shared with me is that a lot of the children in the pre-K class at the school in East Palo Alto struggle with self-regulation. The school primarily serves underprivileged populations, and the school just doesn't have enough resources to evaluate new edtech products that perhaps could help children learn a little bit more about self-regulation skills. So at this point, it's like, well, this is super aligned with my own interest. Hugh talked about when you're joining a startup, you want to really believe in their mission. I was 100% bought into the primary school's mission. And so when this kind of challenge was brought up, to me, what I heard is that, well, there's a particular edtech product that's already been identified. Then what's needed is we need to run a pilot with some target students in that age group. So I'm offered up my time and also my skill set of being able to run the pilot with students, and during that pilot, being able to observe what are the pains and the gains from the program. So that was the beginning. I would say this is the first stepping stone for the rest of the gigs. One thing that I, in reflecting on my journey, that I'm hugely grateful for is that every single gig that I did mattered, because your experiences are stackable. Like I felt with every gig, I got closer and closer to doing more complex and full-fledged UX research projects, starting with running a small pilot at a school to actually working with a product manager and a designer at an agency. Everything in between helped me build up the skill sets. And also why these gigs are important. Now that I'm sitting on the other end of the table, I encourage a lot of people who come to me for advice is that from an interviewer point of view, like from my point of view as an interviewer today, you just need one really solid story to answer questions about how to collaborate with a product manager and designer. Maybe at different companies different, but when I was interviewing after my gig at the agency for full-time jobs, I interviewed at 2 companies, and at that time I only had one experience working with a product manager and designer, and I used that story and landed both jobs. So for me, I think it's important to, when you're thinking about gigs, that interviewers will ask you about these questions about how to collaborate with these important cross-functional stakeholders. Find ways to get at least one good experience, solid experience where you can share stories from. So I think that kind of wraps up my presentation, and I just want to leave everyone with 4 takeaways. The first takeaway is just, no matter where you're coming from, either from undergrad, from grad school, from like other careers, just know that you have valuable knowledge and skill sets from past experiences. And it's really, it might be a creative exercise to think about how you might leverage them to break into the next career, if that's UX. There's a lot of transferable skills. The second one is, if you're thinking about gigs, start with organizations you care about. From my experience, I found that passion really sells. Like one of the reasons why I think a lot of my initial gigs are in education is because that was the field that I'm most passionate about. And even if I never had a certain kind of specific experience, for example, I never worked in a school before, the passion really makes up for some of that lack of direct experience. There are also a few like pro bono opportunities that I've come across over the last couple of years where I felt like it really helped people build portfolio. One is United States Digital Services. I think I got that wrong. USDS. Okay, I'm gonna have to get back. If other people know, please jump in. And then the second one is Tech Fleet. It also helps match people up with projects. The third one is just know, even though you are doing gigs, know that your skill set is worth actual money and compensation. I would encourage you to either negotiate by the project or by the hour. One of the common, I think, pitfalls that I fell into in the very beginning, and also I've seen other people fall into, is thinking that, oh, I'm going to get a great project out of this, so I don't need to be paid. But actually, your experience with the client would be much harder when it's free, because they don't have any skin in the game. Especially if you're thinking about UX research, you need their help in recruiting participants for your research. If they don't have any incentive to help you, it could drag on for a long time. So if the organization you want to help has a very limited budget, just at a minimum ask for a nominal fee of like maybe a few $100s so that they have some skin in the game. And lastly, just remember that every single project you work on with a client, external client, just makes awesome material for your portfolio. And it'll, in the end, help you answer lots of interview questions that might come up about your stakeholder management skills. Yeah, and that wraps up my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuxi. That was incredible. Awesome to hear your journey and how you've landed in the role that you're in today. We have a lot of questions for you as well. One of the things that I took away from that, your process for finding gigs actually mirrors very closely our process at Harness for finding projects with clients for our students. We spend a lot of time trying to think about what are the challenges that they're solving, who are the passionate people in these organizations, so that we can curate projects that give students these really in-depth, healthy experiences of learning and obviously getting a portfolio piece. So just an interesting mirroring as I was listening to your presentation. So let's jump to some questions. We'll do a few and then we'll go to Nick and then we'll come back to the remaining questions. So let me just scroll through. We've got quite a few, so bear with me. One of the ones for Yuxi here are, do you believe UX, so this is from Natasha, is learning UX design necessary in order to be a UX researcher? Did applying your soft skills from previous experiences help you in your UX research career? And if so, how? So we may have covered a part of that second part of that question, but interesting to know about the UX design component and how did that help?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that UX design education would help you be a much stronger collaborator with design team. So Hugh and Nick would appreciate you as a UX researcher if you have an eye for design, and especially at a company that's Coursera with 300 people, it's kind of a little bit more startup. We didn't have a big research.
Oops, looks like we've lost you.
Talking to walk. Oh, you lost me?
We just had a bit of a buffering, but I think you're back.
Oh, okay, I'm back. Okay. So yeah. So I was just saying that when the research team was smaller, and currently we still have this capacity struggle as well, is there's always needs to do cognitive walkthroughs or do some kind of user testing on designs at different stages. If you have great sense of understanding of the different design principles, you can really help the team speed up that evaluation process. Like, so for example, my mentor, when I was choosing what's my first, where would I go for my first full-time research position, I really looked for a mentor in a manager, and that's how I chose Coursera. And my current manager is a really well-trained designer as well as researcher with 3 decades of experience in UX. So I learned a lot actually from him. I basically learned a lot from watching him critique designs and the kind of ways that he looks at design through the lens of different heuristics. That's very valuable. But you don't have to learn all the ins and outs of Figma, for example. I don't have that skill, but I can comment on Figma with my design collaborators. And so I think also on the soft skill side, it's an absolute plus if you have previous professional experience where you can showcase that you are very collaborative and you know how to prioritize different requests and how to say no diplomatically to people.
Great, thanks, Yuxi. The next question is just about the gigs again, perhaps going a little bit deeper in how you landed those gigs without an established portfolio. So, for example, this person asks, were they already looking for a UX researcher, product manager they've written here, or did you just pitch yourself and convince them?
Yeah, that's a great question. For my first gig at the school, I would say they were not looking for a UX researcher. They didn't know, they were looking for somebody to help. It was a kind of an undefined job or / it was a gig. So it was very much a gig, like 5 hours per week. I would say that what helped me land that initial gig, I think it's mostly my interest in education. The fact that I actually was studying education or just finished studying, getting a degree in education and worked with kids through my program. So it wasn't professional experience, it's more my graduate study projects. And then for the second gig, that was a little bit more, definitely a lot more formal, is a full-time contract job with a startup. I pitched them based on my master's project. So it's also not a professional quote unquote experience, but it was a project where I showed that I could take something from beginning to end. and then they asked me, they gave me a take home assignment to do a competitor analysis. So I think in that one I felt like it went back to my old wheelhouse of looking at products and companies and evaluating them, comparing them. It was less of a UX task, I would say, but during that, when I was doing that first startup gig, I actually started interacting a lot more, seeking mentorship from the very vibrant UX community here in the Bay Area. I was very grateful to have met people who were willing to talk to me about methodology. I actually got a senior UX researcher to do a couple mentorship sessions with me, and the startup reimbursed me for those coaching sessions because they knew I needed to learn, I needed to be coached, but they didn't have resources themselves. So I, yeah, I hope that answers your question. It's not linear at all. There's a lot of curvy paths.
Thanks, Yuxi. Okay, so we'll take one more question for Yuxi, and we'll come back to some more later on. So the next one here is from Yulia, who's quite interested in UX research. However, their background so far has been in account management for a SaaS company. Do you think it's realistic to start in UX research?
I think absolutely. I have not met like two UX researchers with the same background. Like on my team currently, we have people who come from like chemical engineering background. Can you believe it? You can start out as a chemical engineer and pivot into a UX researcher. I think absolutely. I think the first step is thinking about what are your transferable skills and starting to think about building that portfolio of projects. Especially thinking sometimes. So I guess like related to the first question, if you don't have clients, you've never worked with an external partner on any projects, come up with your own project. That's what I did. For my master's project, it was my own project to study evening routines with parents and 3 to 5 year olds, and designing a prototype to support them in that experience. So I think maybe that's actually square number one is think about what you might create for your own project and then leverage that as a way to get the first external client.